Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to talk about how in just 50 short years, the origin of tea to England changed from being predominantly from China to negligible from China, and the long-term ramifications of this both in China and in England and even here in the United States. Now before we begin, if you haven't done so already, go check us out at the Tea Shop. We are in New Braunfels, Texas, if you haven't done so already. Also subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't done so already. And please post a comment. So we're in the midst of the history of tea, and we are in the late 1800s. And this is kind of full circle to what I talked about. I did a 4-part series on how England stole the tea leaf from China. And this is kind of similar to that, but I wanted to demonstrate how things changed so quickly. So we know 1850 or so, East India Company sent Robert Fortune to essentially do industrial espionage and, for among other things, steal the Camellia sinensis plant. Remember, at that time they didn't know if there were multiple variants of it. They thought green tea and black tea came from different plants. All they had was the finished product. They had no idea how to process the different teas into the different categories, and they really didn't even know that there were 6 categories at this time. So in 1850, and prior to this, remember, tea got to Europe around 1660. So from 1660 to 1850, all the tea was from China. If you were drinking tea in whatever place, not just in Europe, but in the colonies had a rapacious, just voracious tea consumption. It all came from China. But what happened? Well, we talked about it in that 4-part episode, how eventually Fortune and the EIC were successful in not only just transplanting Camellia sinensis to India, which was a British colony, but also was able to change the market preference from green tea to black tea. See, prior to this time, if you look at the 1700s, green tea, mostly Hyson, and black tea, mostly Keeman and Congo, were rivaling each other. Now, they weren't drinking oolongs in Europe. They certainly weren't drinking whites and yellows. I mean, some of it was shipped, but it was not popular. It was mostly green and black, and they were sugaring up green tea back during this time, late 1600s, 1700s, up to the 1800s. But what happened? So because the British were able to start growing their own tea on their own colonies, well, they're going to use that to their advantage and grow teas that are going to have a market in Europe. And also what happened was Fortune, as I mentioned, found out that they were using essentially poisonous compounds to make the green tea even greener. Now, they weren't doing this to poison Europe, but they knew that there was a market for very kind of super bright green, like almost like Gyokuro green. And so the Chinese tea makers were using gypsum and other things that were poisonous. So when Fortune wrote about this, and the tea lovers and the tea sellers in England found out about it, they were like, whoa, we got to stop drinking this. So that definitely had a role too. So if you look, 1850, 100% practically of tea consumption or tea production was from China. If you look at 1900, rapidly different. So 55% of it was from India. 35% of it was from Ceylon. We had talked about previously about Ceylon and the Lipton family. And then you had a small percentage from Indonesia, and only 7% was coming from China by 1900. And what are the long-term ramifications of this? Well, a lot of this was black tea, of course. So black tea became the tea of preference for the West, including us. And you also see that, well, it makes sense that English colonies are going to start making this, because then they can control the supply, they can control the demand, they control everything. So in the early 1900s, what do you see? You see other English colonies starting to make tea. You see Kenya. You see Malawi. It wasn't called Malawi back then, but Nyasaland. And you see these African colonies starting to make tea. And that's the seedlings for that. And we know today, if you know anything about black tea, especially CTC, crushed torn curl, the essentially low-grade crap that's used in iced tea and in most black tea bags, they come from Kenya. Kenya makes sizable, almost 50% of the black tea CTC consumption. And Malawi and these other countries make quite a bit. Nepal makes quite a bit. A lot of it, the lower grade stuff comes from Ceylon, still in India. So this is where you see that growth. So I feel bad for China, because you think about China, and we talked about in the 4-part series on Robert Fortune stealing the tea plant, how the Opium War was essentially a tea war. So England didn't like the trade imbalance that it had to get tea, because it had to use bullion. So they essentially fomented this war to open up more ports so they can get more access to the Chinese market. And then they essentially steal the tea plant from China, grow it in their own area. And during this time in the late 1800s, this is the century of tumult in Chinese history. They're getting doped up in opium. They're getting carved up by the European powers, each of them having their own spheres of influence in China. The monarchy is finally dying. It dies in 1911 or so. This is a bleak time in Chinese history. And you see by the end of this time with the tea preference, it's almost like England came in, got what it wanted, and got the heck out and started growing its own tea to the detriment, of course, of the Chinese economy and to the Chinese people. And it's quite sad. And so you see this played out. And only now, maybe you say the last 20 years, do you see people now going back to China and actually buying tea that comes from China again. So you kind of see this full circle, but sadly under negative auspices, because what happened in this, I'm not saying England is only responsible for this, but you see what happened after the fall of the monarchy and then the creation of the democracies over there by Sun Yat-sen. You eventually see the Chinese communists taking over after a long civil war. And now, and I'm not only blaming the English, 100 million people have died under Chinese communism. Great leap forward, all the industrialization, all the pogroms, all these things that you see in classic communism, not just in China, but in Russia and Cambodia and all these places. And it's just quite sad. So you see these long-term ramifications, but you just see it played out and just in this tea world where in 1850 all the tea's from China, 1900 none of it's from China anymore, and now it's all black tea. At this point, it's not yet tea bag tea, cut up fine fannings. We'll talk about that in a future episode when that starts to happen. It's still loose leaf. It's still thrown in a teapot. They use a filter to catch a strainer, I should say, to catch it, and that's still doing the traditional way. But everything now is away from China. It's too expensive. We already had our way with China. Now we're growing them in our domains, and you can of course see from an English economy, English market, English tea companies, because the EIC is gone by now. By 1900, you can see why they were doing it, right? It's a cheaper supply, cheaper demand, all these things. You can control the market. You don't have to rely on another country. So you could see why they would do it. And so black tea becomes predominant because that's what's easily grown in Kenya and in Malawi, in Ceylon, in India, whether it be Camellia sinensis or Camellia sinensis assamica. This is what's grown. This is what's become super popular in England. And as a result, because much of our fashion, much of our culture came from England, from the motherland, this was the predominant tea that you would find in the American colonies during the 1800s and the 1900s as well. So all these things have such long-term historical implications. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and God bless.